Thank you all for very interesting presentations. You can call them maybe teasers, and we have a little bit more time to dive into what you've been talking about. But I would actually just like to open with an open question, and anybody who wants to answer could do that. But I want to create some clarity within the concept. What defines a microgrid, and is that different from a virtual power plant, and energigemenskap, energy community? Anybody?
Well, a microgrid works autonomously, even when the grid is blacked out, for example, if it's connected to a grid. And we usually have one or more energy sources, one or more loads. But isn't that the key word, autonomous?
We define it like that in the projects we're in.
Yeah.
But we have come across situations where it's been used for other purposes also. In Sweden, where you had parallel grids for a certain area, it has been used. But I agree that your definition there is the better one.
So if you differ that from a virtual power plant or energigemenskap, is that it doesn't necessarily have to work autonomously. Perfect.
Precisely.
Maybe it's a bit dangerous to relate it to virtual power plant, because virtual power plant, if your main purpose is deliver energy and play in the energy market, then it's something that the network operator would not do, because they should not interfere with the network owner part, and then the energy part. They should not work too tightly together.
I see that, and I realize also now that I'm standing here thinking that virtual power plants can actually also be distributed over a very large area. But starting at the grid connected end again, maybe Kyriaki, I will direct this question to you. What is needed to allow the DSOs to benefit from these economical benefits that you were talking about in your presentation from microgrids?
Yeah, that is a good question. Probably business models for sure. Because the main questions for the DSOs is who is going to invest and own the distributed resources, and then who is going to operate the grid assets in the microgrid. So I think this unbundling framework in Europe has a little bit been a hinder to integration of more microgrids actually, because you need to have, it's not compared to the cost of the generation that we need to have an islanded microgrid. The control part is much smaller, I would say. But then why would the end users invest on it if there isn't a plan to utilize them? And I think I don't know, it's hard for me to see the DSOs driving this concept, like being the driving force for this concept right now. So it is a good question on who is going to implement this so that we can use this flexibility.
And Dan-Erik, I think maybe you had a comment on this too.
Yeah, regarding the DSOs, the roles are changing a bit because the grid operators are now getting a system responsibility on local level, the DSOs. They didn't used to have that. It was the TSO in Sweden that had the system responsibility. So it's an island mode capacity is like an insurance. It's not so fun to have until you really need it. And since the uptime is 99.98% in Sweden, it's not very often we do need it. So paying for it needs to be distributed over like an insurance all the time. And the model for how DSOs are operating and calculate and get their revenues needs to take that in account, which is not so much so today.
And maybe Peiyuan, I know that you have DSOs involved in both the project you were talking about and the other project that I know you were doing on microgrids, since I know the whole SamspEL portfolio by heart. But so can you say something maybe on the motivation of the DSOs to investigate islanding capability of microgrids?
Yeah, I think this could be from not only the DSO but also upstream grid, since they have to fulfill the N-1. I mean, if you have a long 130 kV single transmission line feeding into your local grid, And since we have to fulfill this N-1 criteria, that the electricity should be back within 12 or 24 hours, then this could be a very good and a competitive solution to build another transmission line or bury that transmission down to ground, especially in low population density areas, because then the utilization of that transmission line would not be very high. So there we see a very good competitive solution from microgrid operation.
Okay, perfect. And I will let you in very soon. But I'm just thinking now, who is responsible then for both the cost and the implementation of the technology that's needed to enable islanding? Would that be the TSO then in this case that you're talking about, or
not necessarily? Then it will be a regional grid operator. In that case, who owns the 40 or 130 kV lines? If we're looking at the medium voltage microgrid, sorry, I have to add that.
True. So, do you have any comments on what we've been?
I mean, it is a tricky question. If we look in some African countries where we also work, and then predominantly with grid-tied microgrids, because it's a much more severe issue with the outages, for example. We normally need to seek licenses to get certain facilities going off-grid, or at least partly off-grid, because of course that affects the revenue streams for the national grid corporation, etc. But still, it's a great benefit for them, because if you look at a larger holistic perspective, all the losses to the manufacturing industry in the countries, etc., can be taken care of, and also critical things in society, hospitals, etc. It can be quite expensive for grid companies when you have very long outages.
So we have outages here as the main driver, and I think maybe it's time for you, Erik, to maybe talk about the example that was in your last slide, because
it was just a very recent conversation with a customer that like a week ago. So we found out that even in Stockholm there are rather large costs for grid outages for technology-intensive companies that have intensive manufacturing that suffers a lot. So, I mean, even in urban areas, it's valid.
And would you see that the cost of implementing the battery and the additional technology for islanding mode is cheaper than the cost of the outages for this case?
Yeah, for this case, it was a clear case. And then the question is, what is best? Should every subscriber do this themselves? And then I mean every grid connection? Or like our project, SDN Microsense, looking at it on a middle to low voltage transformer area, where there could be mutual benefits from different buildings within the same local area.
And then this is another interesting question. If you move up from the building, sort of, setting a barrier around the building, who would be responsible for managing the microgrid if you move up a little bit? Any thoughts on that?
For us, when we work with microgrids to different kinds of clients, specifically clients like that lose quite a lot of money when they have short outages, we have our own O&M organization taking care of that. And we also work closely with our hardware suppliers, for example. And for us, it's also super important with the data gathering, avoiding like blame games. We have super control over our systems, making sure that we always know how much are we producing, etc. So I think data here is also a key to managing a good O&M structure in microgrids.
And do you have a comment? Or?
No, I agree. Yeah, data is
king.
Is the king, yeah, or queen. But about who is the responsible party, it's very tricky because it doesn't fit into the regulation of what the DSO should be doing. So maybe the future concept of energy communities that are coming could be something, but these laws are not written yet.
And Kyriaki, in your research area or planned projects, are you planning to take the research that you're doing, for example, in the micro to mega project, and investigate island mode as the next stage?
No, I think my focus actually will be on providing flexibility from grid-connected microgrids, so how to enable this interaction between the DSO and the microgrids. There are also very interesting questions in the energy management for islanding mode. Of course, it's quite different compared to the grid-connected mode. But yeah, I think I will focus on this one. And I just wanted to add on this, like who operates the microgrid, because this is also a very important question for my research, of course. There are also examples, real-world examples, where you have utility assets from the DSO and then the energy resources operated by a different party. It can be a community, it can be a building if it is a small building. So I think there can be agreements, and it is very interesting to describe this process of how we can have one microgrid even within the present regulations that we have today. Yeah.
And yes, then I move into a little bit to the next question before I check if we have anything from the audience. But is there any development needed both on the regulatory side but also on the technical side when it comes to allowing parts of the grid to go into islanding mode? And maybe I will start with you, Peiyuan. So development needed either on the technical side or on the regulatory side to allow for islanding of parts of the grid?
Well, both, I think. From the academic point of view, regulation is never our limit. And I mean, as I said before also, one of the things that we should look more on cross-sectoral cooperation, and we should also look to think about if we should copy what we did in transmission system and do it in island operation, or should we do something smarter? And in the end, also, we wanted to make this a competitive solution. So if we can control this energy storage in the microgrid in such a way that we don't need so much of it, that's, I think, will increase the likelihood that this will become a more a competitive solution in the future.
So reducing the size of the battery to create a more cost-effective solution, yes, basically. Yes. Any other comments on development needed on the regulatory side or the technical side?
I think, as mentioned, the regulatory side really needs to become clearer for us, and clever software as well, how to manage all the different components in the microgrid to optimize it in a good way, and also safe ways of gathering data, because electricity can also be a sensitive question. So that's my thoughts.
And I had a question in mind. I will just check to see if we have any questions from the audience, and we do. And now I will simultaneously translate it to English, so we'll have patience with me. Yes, okay. So the question is what you think about microgrids with DC that we start hearing more and more about. Yeah, the question is that something that we will see more of, do you think? So specifically the DC microgrids.
I think so.
There is, it depends on the situation and the loads connected. There is quite high costs in shifting a lot of equipment if it's not DC operated, and if there already is a grid in a certain area, AC grid, there's not that much extra benefit from a DC grid, since I would say.
Any other comments on that question? I think maybe it has to do a little bit with the regulatory barriers that we have today, that we see these. That's, I guess, from my side.
True. I agree.
So let's see if it is the last question. But you talked a little bit about cases where you go completely off grid. So maybe can you say something about when it makes sense to have a microgrid that's connected and can go into island mode sometimes, and when you choose to go completely off grid?
Sometimes you have prerequisites that doesn't allow you to be near the grid. I think now when many have diesel backup generators, so when those subsidies are removed, I think we will see more and more of these grid-connected microgrids as well. But also when you have these society-sensitive services, and if we have also an electricity situation in Sweden that will become more and more challenging, you need to really secure that you can be in island mode maybe for several hours. So yeah, that's my short answer. Yeah.
Thank you, and I will give all of you a chance to give one little short answer before in these last 30 seconds that we have, and that is if you think that island capability will be something that will be included in energigemenskaper, for example, because it's such a small cost to add once you have all these resources in a certain place. So maybe a short yes or no, and perhaps 2 more words to explain.
I say definitely yes. Within sooner or later, it could be 20 years away, but it's going to be a natural thing that a complete grid failure in the TSO level will not result in grid failure locally in cities, for sure.
Thank you. And Peiyuan and Kyriaki, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think we should do more pilot sites and so to get used to this operation. And then I see anyway microgrids as a more Swiss knife sort of functionality. I mean, there are so many different functions. Why not using it? Yeah.
Any last words? Or?
No, I agree with this. Yeah, islanding capabilities. It's mostly software control that you need compared to all these generation assets that you need to have. So, exactly, there are many different functions and.
Let's use them.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so our time is up, and I want to thank you all for this interesting discussion.